They thought he was just another tired black man in a wrinkled suit. No lawyer, no allies, no chance. He walked into that courtroom like smoke, quiet, steady, impossible to hold. Two officers laughed. The judge barely looked up. They saw a defendant. They never expected to meet their reckoning, because when he reached into his coat, they didn't see it coming. Not the badge, not the title, not the years of silence he carried like a weapon. Deputy Director, Federal Investigations Division, Internal Affairs. That's what the badge said. And by then, it was already too late. You're watching a true story about power perception and the cost of ignoring quiet men. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Let us know in the comments. The courtroom was neither grand nor old, just a box of beige walls and tired tile floors echoing with the shuffle of papers and the murmurs of strangers waiting for their names to be called. The fluorescent lights above hummed with a faint buzz, casting a cold tone over the benches that lined the back wall like pews in a forgotten church. The bailiff's voice cracked through the room without conviction. Marshal Kane, as if he were announcing a plumbing bill, not a person. Heads barely turned. Some were too tired to care. Others were too used to the rhythm of this place where black men came in quiet and left in cuffs. But from the very last bench a man stood tall, lean, dressed in a gray coat wrinkled from travel collar, folded just enough to suggest he hadn't come here expecting a show. He didn't walk fast. He didn't hesitate. He moved like someone who'd counted every step in advance and knew exactly where each one would lead. Two officers in the back, both white, both uniformed, leaned toward each other with smirks half hidden behind crossed arms. "That's him," one whispered. The other gave a low chuckle. "Gotta be. Look at him. Probably one of those sovereign citizen guys gonna tell the judge the Constitution doesn't apply." The laugh that followed wasn't loud, but loud enough to draw a glance from a woman seated nearby. They didn't notice her. They never do. Kane said nothing. His face gave nothing away. Eyes forward, posture, upright hands relaxed. The kind of stillness you don't learn in law school, you earn it in rooms where being right doesn't keep you safe. He approached the defendant's table without ceremony, set down a folded sheet of paper and waited. Not a twitch, not a glance behind. The silence he carried with him wasn't empty, it was deliberate, heavy. The kind of silence that makes people second-guess everything they thought they knew about who you were. From the bench, Judge Gerald Pruitt peered over bifocals too low on his nose, pushing them up with the back of a pen. He was a man built like a chair that used to be comfortable, but had been sat in too long upright but worn. "Mr. Kane," he began, flipping through a thin manila file, "you're here on charges of failure to comply and verbal obstruction during a routine traffic stop. Do you understand the nature of these charges?" Kane's voice was steady, measured. "That's what the report says." The judge paused. "You're not represented by counsel today." Kane didn't blink. "I don't require one." A second wave of quiet laughter rolled from the back bench. The same two officers shared a look, this one more amused than the first. One of them muttered, "He's serious." The other whispered back, "Wait till the judge hands him the fine. He'll crack." Kane didn't look their way. He didn't have to. He'd heard that tone before in locker rooms, conference rooms, airports, and jury pools. That peculiar laugh of men who thought they knew the whole story from just a glance. But they didn't know his name, not really. They didn't know the weight that came with it or the folder tucked inside his coat. They saw a man in a worn suit who wasn't afraid to be alone at the front of a courtroom. And to them, that meant weakness. But to Kane, it was a position of clarity. From the front, you see who people really are. The judge leaned back slightly. "Very well. Since this appears to be a minor violation and there is no counsel present, we'll keep this brief. Mr. Kane, is there anything you'd like to say before we proceed?" Kane took a step forward. No flourish, no sudden movement. His hand reached calmly into his inner coat pocket. One of the officers in the back stood abruptly, palm twitching toward the holster on his belt. The room tensed. The bailiff shifted in his stance. Kane paused just long enough for the silence to gather weight, then drew out a slim laminated badge. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a scene. He walked up to the judge's bench and laid the badge down gently like a final puzzle piece, placed with quiet confidence. "My name is Marshal Kane," he said, "Deputy Director of Internal Compliance Federal Investigations Division." The room didn't just go quiet, it froze. The air seemed to thicken around the edges. The judge stared at the badge, as if he were waiting for it to vanish. The officers in the back stopped laughing. One sat down too fast, the other blinked and muttered, "No way." Kane didn't need to say anything more. In that moment, the smirks, the whispers, the assumptions, every last one of them evaporated. Not because he raised his voice, but because the silence spoke for him. And in places like this, silence is the one thing they never expect you to own. It was just after 10 p.m. when Marshal Kane eased his rental car onto the shoulder of a dimly lit county road, the kind of stretch where the trees crowd close to the asphalt and the air feels thick with things unsaid. The sky was a wash of deep blue and orange, not quite night, not quite memory, and his headlights carved two quiet tunnels through the dark. He had been driving for hours, small towns, shuttered gas stations, the occasional faded billboard, reminding him what politicians thought mattered to rural America. His silver sedan, a nondescript Camry, with a government-issue tag he kept covered, hummed low as he brought it to a full stop. The red and blue lights flared behind him without warning. No slow approach, no grace. Just a burst of urgency that said this wasn't about traffic. He exhaled slowly, not out of fear but ritual, the same way you brace yourself before a storm even when you know the roof's been patched. In his rearview mirror he saw two white officers exit their cruiser, one already flicking a flashlight in his hand like a habit, the other adjusting his belt as if preparing for a show. Kane didn't reach for anything. Not yet. He rolled the window halfway and waited. The first officer stepped up, fast, heavy boots crunching gravel. He knocked on the window hard, no pause between arrival and demand. "License and registration," he barked, voice sharp, impatient. Kane turned, meeting the man's eyes with the calm of someone who's had practice staying still. "Evening, officer," he said evenly. "May I ask the reason for the stop?" The cop didn't flinch, didn't offer a name. "You failed to signal during your last lane change." Kane nodded, once slow. "I believe I did signal, but here's my license," he said, handing over the card. The officer snatched it without looking. From the passenger's side came a second knock, lighter but no less commanding. The other officer had circled around, appearing at the edge of Kane's vision. "Got anything in the car we should know about?" he asked. Kane turned slightly. "No, sir." There was a pause, a small invisible test hanging in the air. Then the first officer leaned in, his voice edged now. "You got something to hide?" Kane shook his head. "I asked why I was being stopped." "That's not hiding, that's knowing my rights." That was the moment it changed. Not dramatically, not like in movies, but with a tightening in the shoulders, a hardening in the tone. The first officer said, "Step out of the vehicle." Kane didn't move, didn't raise his voice. "I haven't refused anything," he said. "I'm cooperating. I'd just like to know what's happening here." But by then, they weren't listening. The second officer opened the passenger door without warning. Out of the car now. Kane's heartbeat didn't quicken. He had long learned that panic is a privilege reserved for those not expected to stay composed. He slid the recorder inside his coat pocket up just slightly, clicked it on with a press of his thumb, then unbuckled his seatbelt. The moment his shoes touched the gravel, the first officer grabbed his arm hard. Kane didn't pull away. "There's no need for force," he said quietly, but the cop shoved him forward anyway. The ground came fast. His knee hit first, then his shoulder, then his cheek pressed into the rough road edge, like it had been waiting for him. He felt the weight of a knee between his shoulder blades, pressure sharp and intimate. "We got a non-compliant male," one of them called over the radio. "Possible flight risk." Kane stared at the ground, eyes fixed on a piece of broken glass, caught in the dirt, its edge catching the rotating red and blue. He didn't shout, he didn't beg. He just memorized every phrase, every breath, every insult. Because that's what the job required. Not vengeance, not even justice. Just memory that couldn't be erased. They cuffed him and dragged him up without ceremony. "What's your destination?" one asked, checking his wallet again. Kane didn't hesitate. "Can't say," he replied. "Federal protocol." The phrase hit them like a bad joke. "You think you're above the law," one snapped, spitting the words. Kane met his gaze squarely. "No, sir," he answered. "I respect it enough to follow it." By the time they loaded him into the cruiser, the tone had shifted again. Not out of guilt, but performance. They had a story to build now, a narrative that explained why a calm man in a rental car had to be on the ground. At the station, the report was filed with haste and broad strokes. Subject was argumentative, refused to state travel plans, displayed evasive behavior. No mention of who opened the door, no mention of body cams. Kane asked for a phone call. He was told, maybe in the morning. He asked for a supervisor. The reply was, a look then, a smirk. You'll have plenty of time to talk in court. They placed him in a holding cell metal bench, flickering light overhead, the faint smell of bleach and defeat. He sat upright, hands folded back against the wall. Not because it was comfortable, but because it was familiar. A space where truth becomes a waiting game, and dignity must be guarded like breath. And all the while the small recorder in his coat ticked silently, preserving what they would later claim never happened. In that stillness, Kane didn't wonder why. He didn't need to. The why had never been personal. It was systematic, predictable. They saw a black man driving alone out-of-state plates, a quiet car in a loud world. And for them that was enough. Enough to escalate. Enough to forget procedure. Enough to assume authority didn't belong to him. But what they didn't know was that Marshall Kane wasn't just another name in the system. He was the one who tracked the patterns. The one who asked about the missing footage, the incomplete files, the complaints that vanished. And as he sat alone that night, he wasn't preparing a defense, he was preparing a mirror. Because the real trial wouldn't happen in that holding cell. It would happen when the silence was broken and the right people were forced to listen. The cell was colder than it should have been, not because the air was cold, but because everything in it had the chill of neglect: metal bench, concrete walls, a drain in the corner stained with rust and memory. The single bulb above buzzed with an uneven flicker, casting a harsh white glow that seemed to hum just enough to get under the skin. Marshall Kane sat on the bench, hands folded back, pressed lightly against the cinderblock wall, as if he didn't want to give it the satisfaction of holding his weight completely. His jacket had been taken, so had his phone, his pen, and his belt. What remained was the stillness he carried, like armor, quiet, deliberate, practiced. There was no clock inside the cell, but he could tell time by instinct, the way a trained mind counts silence like heartbeats. He guessed it had been about 2 hours since they closed the door, maybe 3. Long enough for the adrenaline to wear off, for the sting in his wrists to settle into a dull throb, for the whole thing to stop feeling like a mistake and start feeling like a pattern. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to focus. Not on what they'd done, but on what came next. Marshall had never been the type to stew in anger. Anger was too loud, too volatile. It drew attention before it did any good. No, what he believed in was pressure, quiet, consistent, immovable. The kind of pressure that cracked concrete over time, not all at once, but enough to shift the ground beneath a man who thought he was standing on solid truth. A voice echoed down the hallway, a radio call, garbled, indistinct. Then footsteps, heavy, slowing near his door. A moment of pause, a rattle of keys, and then nothing. Just the sound of boots turning away. No eye contact, no check-in, no questions. Whoever it was didn't want to deal with him, didn't want to be the one to realize they'd locked up the wrong man for the wrong reason, in the wrong moment. He opened his eyes again and looked around the cell, not at it, through it, as if studying the space for its blind spots, its weaknesses, the way a good investigator does when he walks into a scene that already stinks of cover-up. Down the corridor, a fluorescent light flickered, then died with a faint pop, plunging a small section into shadow. From where he sat, Marshall could hear a young officer laugh quietly, then say, "We'll let him stew a while longer." Another voice, older, slower, replied, "Should have kept his mouth shut. They never learn." Marshall didn't flinch. That kind of comment had stopped being personal a long time ago. It wasn't about him. It was about the uniform he wasn't wearing, the badge they hadn't seen, the skin that spoke louder than any title ever could. He'd met men like them before, men who carried power like a hammer, always looking for a nail, never stopping to ask if something just needed fixing. And while they chuckled, he remembered every word. Not to retaliate, but to record, to document. To build the kind of truth they couldn't erase once it hit daylight. He shifted slightly, easing his back against the wall, feeling the bruises settle beneath his ribs. Every breath reminded him of how rough the takedown had been. Not excessive enough to leave marks they couldn't explain, but deliberate enough to send a message. You don't belong in control here. He did not respond to the pain, not even in his posture. That, too, was practice, years of knowing that any sign of weakness would be read as confirmation. Somewhere farther down the hallway, a door creaked open, followed by the unmistakable click of dress shoes on polished tile. Then silence. Then more laughter fading into footsteps that went the other way. They weren't coming for him tonight. No supervisor, no lawyer, no phone call. Just the drip of something unseen in the distance and the buzz of a vending machine that no longer worked but still hummed like it had a purpose. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands together like in prayer, but there was no asking in him, only calculation. He went over the sequence again, the stop, the questions, the moment the officer opened the passenger door without cause, the moment he felt the knee in his back, each word, each movement, each failure of protocol. He organized it all in his head, not just as memory but as testimony, because in his world what happened to you didn't matter unless you could prove it. And proof was the one thing he knew how to gather better than anyone else in that building. The small recorder in his coat, wherever they had tossed, it was still running, unless they'd thought to turn it off, which given their confidence they likely hadn't. That recorder had heard everything, and so had he. That meant the case wasn't just open. It was airtight. If he'd been anyone else, they might have gotten away with it. But he wasn't anyone else. He was the man the Bureau sent when things needed to be documented without prejudice and exposed without fear. Outside the cell, the night dragged on. The officers finished their reports, closed their notebooks, patted each other on the back, and left behind what they thought was another clean shift. Inside, Marshal Kane remained, still letting time pass without chasing it, letting the building breathe its arrogance, unaware that the man they had locked behind a steel door wasn't waiting to be freed. He was waiting for the right time to open the door himself. The courtroom felt different that morning, like it had been scrubbed of its usual rhythm and left hollow, waiting for something it didn't understand. Sunlight leaked through high windows in faded strips, casting long lines across the polished wood floor and catching dust that floated slowly, as if even the air wasn't sure what came next. People spoke in hushed tones, not out of respect, but because silence had started to feel heavier than words. Somewhere near the front, a bailiff adjusted the microphone with a squeak, then looked around uncertain where the defendant even was. Then Marshal Kane walked in. He didn't stride or shuffle, didn't nod or scan the room. He simply entered like someone who had been in this space before. Not this exact room maybe, but rooms like it where justice hung thin and people mistook confidence for guilt. His shoes made a soft, even sound on the tile. No chains, no escort. Just him wearing the same wrinkled gray suit from the night before, not out of carelessness but continuity. He wasn't here to start over. He was here to continue the story they'd tried to write without him. He stepped into the aisle calm as ever, eyes forward, the soft murmur of whispers rising behind him like heat from the floor. People noticed him now, more than they had when his name was called. The name had meant nothing to them, but the way he moved, unhurried, deliberate, untouched by the weight of accusation, meant something different. It wasn't arrogance, it was certainty. He approached the table reserved for the defense and stood there, not sitting, not rushing. The judge, Gerald Pruitt, cleared his throat like a man trying to reclaim control of a room that no longer fully belonged to him. He flipped open a thin folder, squinted at the page, and adjusted his glasses in a slow, measured motion. "Mr. Kane," he began, "you are here in regard to charges stemming from an alleged failure to comply with law enforcement during a traffic stop. Are you prepared to proceed without counsel?" Marshall replied without hesitation, "Yes, Your Honor, I am." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Very well. I see no attorney listed on your behalf. Are you aware of your right to representation?" "I am," Kane answered, voice steady, low but clear. "And I waive it." A couple of chuckles rippled from the back of the room. Same officers as before, same smirks, the same disbelief that had followed him since the second he handed over his ID on the side of that road. One leaned in toward the other and muttered something just loud enough to catch a few ears nearby. The judge glanced up, annoyed, but said nothing. His gavel remained untouched. Kane didn't acknowledge the noise. Instead, he took one step forward and reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. The motion was smooth, controlled, but even that was enough to send a ripple through the courtroom. One of the officers stiffened in his seat hand, twitching toward his belt, not drawing his weapon, but close. The air thickened like a curtain slowly dropping. Kane paused just for a breath, then pulled out a small laminated card and a leather badge holder. He stepped forward again, walked to the bench, and without raising his voice, without drama, he placed the badge gently on the wood surface in front of the judge. "My name," he said, "is Marshal Kane, Deputy Director of Internal Compliance Federal Investigations Division. That badge is active, and everything that happened the night I was arrested has been documented." For a second, nothing happened. The room didn't react. It just stopped moving. The judge blinked once, leaned forward slowly, and stared at the badge. His lips parted slightly, then closed again. The officer in the back, the one who'd been laughing, went pale, eyes fixed on the identification like it had started glowing. "You're with the Bureau?" the judge asked, almost unsure whether he believed the question himself. Kane nodded once. "I am. Internal Affairs Division. I supervise misconduct investigations for law enforcement agencies across 6 southern states, including this one." Silence. The real kind. The kind where even the air stops humming. A clerk to the side, middle-aged, practical glasses, the sort of woman who's seen 100 defendants pass through every week, stood slowly and looked at the judge. "Would you like me to confirm, Your Honor?" The judge didn't answer immediately. Then, "Yes, please do." The woman picked up the badge carefully, like it was fragile, and walked out of the room. No one said a word. The officers didn't laugh now. The smirk had drained from their faces, replaced by something else, something closer to dread. Kane turned slightly, meeting their eyes for the first time. Not with malice, not even with challenge, just with attention, like a man taking inventory, like someone checking whether the room he'd walked into was the same one he now stood in. "We didn't know who he was," one of the officers mumbled. The other added, if someone had told us." Kane interrupted without raising his voice. "You didn't ask." And with that, the courtroom returned to stillness. Not the stillness of waiting, but of recognition. The quiet that settles when people realize they've mistaken silence for weakness. When they learn that the man they laughed at last night is the one who decides whether their badge stays on their chest tomorrow. The door opened. The clerk returned, her face unreadable, a small notepad in her hand. She looked at the judge and said simply, "Confirmed. He is who he says he is." The judge sat back, the file on his bench, still open but forgotten. Kane didn't move. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just stood there, letting the truth take up space. The silence in the courtroom didn't crack it, deepened like a stone sinking through water, pulling everything with it. Judge Pruitt sat still, hands folded awkwardly on the bench, his gaze bouncing between the badge, the man standing in front of him, and the room now too quiet to feel comfortable. A moment earlier he had full command of the proceedings, but now his voice caught in his throat like it was waiting for permission to speak again. He leaned back slightly, buying time, clearing his throat in a way that sounded more like retreat than control. "Mr. Kane," he began softer this time, "do you wish to make a formal statement?" Marshall didn't nod or smile. He just stepped a few inches closer to the bench and said, "I'm not here to grandstand. I'm here to correct the record." The judge blinked slowly. "Proceed." Kane's voice remained steady, like it had been rehearsed 100 times, but never once spoken with pride. "I was stopped without probable cause. I was pulled from a vehicle without lawful instruction. I was detained without access to counsel, and my requests for communication with a supervisor were denied." He paused long enough for the weight of his words to settle, then added, "And I have the entire encounter recorded." A sharp inhale came from the left side of the room. One of the officers shifted in his seat, now visibly uncomfortable, his fingers tapping nervously on his belt. The smirk he'd worn just minutes ago had vanished. His partner sat frozen, jaw tight, as if suddenly calculating the consequences of every decision they'd made in the dark. Kane's hand hovered near his inner pocket, but he didn't reach for anything this time. "The recording has already been uploaded to our secure internal system," he said. "It's time-stamped. Audio is clear. Chain of custody documented. The prosecutor, young Thin, too eager to speak in sound bites, finally broke his silence. "Your Honor, we may need a recess to verify." "No," Judge Pruitt interrupted, shaking his head gently. "We're not dragging this out. I want to know right now, Mr. Kane, are you pressing charges?" Kane exhaled slowly. "Not yet. I'm requesting that all charges against me be dropped immediately, and that both arresting officers be placed on administrative leave pending federal review." His voice didn't rise. He didn't need it to. His authority wasn't in volume, it was in the calm weight of inevitability. The judge leaned back, tapping his pen against the bench for a moment. "So noted," he said, and turned to the prosecutor. "Do you have any objection?" The young man stammered, then shook his head. "No objection, Your Honor." The ruling came swiftly, all charges dismissed. Officers Collier and Nash are to be relieved of duty effective immediately. That's when the room changed again, not with outrage, but with an uneasy stillness. The officers remained seated, their faces rigid, as if waiting for someone to explain what had just happened to them, but no one did. Kane turned to face them fully, now not with anger, not with spite, just clarity. "This isn't just about me," he said plainly. "It's about every person you've stopped who didn't have a badge. It's about every citizen who didn't know they had the right to ask questions. I knew, and I still ended up face down on gravel." Collier finally stood, his voice cracking through the hush. "We didn't know who you were," he said, like it might undo something. Kane didn't move. "That's the problem," he said. "You didn't care to." Behind them, a few murmurs stirred, not loud enough to break decorum, but enough to say people had been listening. The clerk, still holding her notepad, watched with a look that had shifted from duty to disbelief. She'd seen a lot over the years, but never this. The bailiff approached cautiously, leaning toward the judge to whisper something about protocol, but the judge waved him off and reached for the gavel. He didn't strike it. He just held it in his hand, resting it gently on the bench like a paperweight. Kane gathered his folder from the defense table and began walking toward the door. He didn't linger, didn't glance back, didn't need to. The room would remember him without being asked to. Outside, the morning sun had finally warmed the sidewalk. People crossing the courthouse lawn paused, sensing something had shifted. A few reporters loitered near the steps, not yet aware that a federal investigation had just been triggered behind the walls they leaned against. Kane ignored them. He walked past the news vans and down the block, breathing in the still, cool air of a town that had just been jolted awake. In his car, he slid behind the wheel and sat for a moment, hand resting on the steering column, eyes forward. There was no satisfaction, no catharsis. Just a low, familiar pulse of purpose in his chest, the kind that never went away. The job wasn't done. This courtroom was just one node in a much larger web. He pulled out his phone, opened a secure channel, and recorded a short memo. Kane, subject preliminary exposure, requesting audit sequence, begin immediate escalation. Then he hit send and started the engine. Back inside, the officers were being led from the courtroom, not in cuffs, but in silence, their steps slower than before, eyes cast downward. The judge remained on the bench, unmoving, as if he too had to sit with what had just taken place. This wasn't justice fully served. It wasn't accountability completed. But it was a start, and for Kane, that was enough for now. That night, back at the motel off the quiet stretch of Route the 17th of March, Kane sat at the edge of his bed with the kind of stillness that doesn't ask for peace, but demands focus. The hum of the old air conditioner buzzed in the corner, pushing out a stream of lukewarm air that barely stirred the heavy silence inside the room. The curtains were drawn tight, though the faint gold from the parking lot lights bled through the edges, casting a long shadow across the patterned carpet. He hadn't turned on the television. He didn't need noise. He needed clarity. His laptop sat open on the nightstand beside him, screen-dimmed cursor blinking over an empty report template, like it too was waiting for permission to speak. Marshall leaned forward, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and took a slow breath through his nose before placing his recorder next to the keyboard. He clicked it once, no playback, no review, not yet. The file was intact. The timestamp was clean. But what mattered now wasn't just what they'd done to him. It was what they'd done before him, and what they'd do again if nobody stepped in. He opened a new folder, titled it Jefferson County Preliminary Audit, and began entering names. Not just the officers who pulled him from the car, but others. The ones whose names had shown up in previous reports. The ones who had been mentioned by former plaintiffs. The ones who filed arrest records that didn't match booking videos if those videos existed at all. He had seen these patterns before dozens of times across states that kept insisting they didn't have a problem. But the numbers always told a different story. Patterns don't lie. People do. He cross-referenced the arrest report from that night language designed to be vague and slippery. Subject displayed evasive behavior. Subject raised tone during questioning. He highlighted every line, copying them into a document labeled Flagged Language Index. Kane had spent years building that database terms designed to justify escalation without evidence, phrases that turned ordinary citizens into threats in the blink of an eye. There were hundreds of them reused across departments like a shared dialect of deflection. And Jefferson County was fluent. He sent a secure message to his contact in Washington, Grace Mendoza, oversight liaison with a sharp mind and a lower tolerance for delay than even Kane himself. The message was short. Preliminary review complete. High-risk indicators confirmed. Requesting audit protocol clearance and support personnel. Priority elevated. Within minutes, the screen flashed with an incoming secure reply. Clearance approved. Staff deployment in motion. Site lockdown to follow confirmation of compliance hold. Kane closed the laptop gently and leaned back in the chair. His shoulders ached, not from the ride, not from the takedown, but from the weight of knowing what came next. The job was never just paperwork, it was confrontation without rage, exposure without spectacle, and the patient, relentless excavation of truth in places built to hide it. He took off his shoes finally and let his feet settle on the worn carpet. From outside the window came the distant sound of a semi rolling past on the highway, a soft thunder that faded quickly into night. He glanced at the clock. 2:37 a.m. Another long day would begin in just a few hours, but rest would have to wait. There was still more to uncover before he could close his eyes. He opened one more window on his laptop, a request for internal compliance history from Jefferson County's Digital Case Archive. A basic search number of citizen complaints in the last 24 months, 84. Number of complaints resolved with discipline, 4. Number of complaints dismissed without internal interviews, 62. He stared at the screen, eyes narrowing. He adjusted the filter, complaints tied specifically to traffic stops, 47. Of those, 39 involved either Black or Latino drivers. He clicked into one of the files at random. A man stopped for a busted taillight, claimed the officer called for backup within 60 seconds. No mention of body cam footage. Final disposition unsubstantiated. Kane checked the timestamp, then flipped to the maintenance logs for department-issued cams on that date. Device error, upload incomplete. He opened another. Same issue. Another. No video. No review. He didn't sigh. He didn't mutter or shake his head. He simply started copying file numbers into a spreadsheet. Out in the hallway of the motel, someone dropped a drink machine soda can with a loud metallic clatter, followed by a faint apology. Kane didn't move. His hands moved with steady rhythm across the keys, documenting, linking, flagging. Each report had a signature. Each missing file had a date. Each error was a fingerprint. By the time the sun crept over the edge of the motel roof, bleeding into the window crease with that faint orange pink of an early southern morning, Kane had reviewed 38 records, pulled 17 file anomalies, and drafted an internal review request against 2 sergeants and 1 deputy chief. The truth wasn't hidden in shadows. It was buried in plain sight under sloppy language, digital dust, and the arrogance of a department that had learned silence was safer than accountability. Marshal Kane didn't pack up his things. He didn't check out. He just saved his work, locked the files in encrypted folders, and made one final note in the margin of his report. Phase 1 complete. Proceeding with on-site inspection. Then he closed the screen, rubbed his hands once like warming them before a long drive, and let the morning settle into his bones. Outside, the town stirred like it had no idea what was coming. And maybe it didn't. But Kane did. And that was enough. Inside the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department the morning after Kane's courtroom revelation, the air felt thicker than usual, like the building itself had just learned to hold its breath. Desks sat quiet, conversations stalled mid-sentence, and the usual morning chuckles over bad coffee were nowhere to be heard. You could feel the hesitation in the way officers typed slower, how they glanced over their shoulders more often, and how doors that normally swung open stayed shut just a little longer. Something unspoken had settled in something that tasted like fear but moved like truth. In the records room tucked behind dispatch, Sergeant Laura Bishop sat hunched over a desktop computer that hadn't been updated since the Obama administration. Her brow was furrowed, her reading glasses smudged from hours of use, and a cold cup of coffee had long since gone forgotten beside her. She wasn't the kind who usually poked into past reports unless instructed. But today felt different. Today felt like the wall everyone had been leaning on for years had finally started to crack. She clicked through old complaint files with deliberate precision eyes, scanning for language patterns she never used to question. Unsubstantiated. Subject uncooperative. No corroborating footage. They showed up like bruises in the same places over and over again. Different names, different badge numbers, same result. She leaned back, let out a breath, and whispered to herself, "How did we not see this?" Down the hall in the server room that always smelled like burnt plastic and toner ink, Brian, IT tech and unofficial ghost of the department, sat alone at his station. He was young, introverted, the kind of guy who wore headphones even when the music wasn't playing just to keep people from talking to him. But that morning he wasn't listening to music. He was running a trace on system access logs from the night Kane was arrested. The request hadn't come through official channels. It came through a secure, anonymous message flagged as Integrity Tier 1. He knew what it meant, even if no one said it out loud. His fingers tapped keys with the urgency of a man who'd rather not be involved, but knew that staying silent wasn't an option anymore. The log popped up 2 access points, one at 3:14 a.m., the other at 7:08 a.m., both tied to the same user ID Officer T. Nash. But there was no corresponding file access report, which meant whatever was opened had either been moved or deleted. Brian frowned, leaned in, and whispered under his breath, "You stupid son of a—" He printed the log. No email, no internal transfer, just paper, just proof. When he stepped into the records room, Laura looked up, startled to see him actually standing there. He handed her the printout without a word, just a small nod. She scanned it, her jaw setting like a lock clicking into place. "You're sure about this?" she asked. Brian only nodded again. "I traced it twice," he said. "If they scrubbed anything, it happened before that courtroom even opened." Laura folded the paper once, tucked it into her file, and stood without another word. Her feet carried more weight now, like she was walking across something fragile and dangerous all at once. Back in her office, she locked the door behind her and sat again. Not out of fear, but to think. Because now the question wasn't if something had been hidden. It was who else knew and how deep the silence went. She opened another file, one from last spring. A young man stopped for a busted license plate light, claimed he was pulled from the vehicle, searched without reason, released without citation. The report said officer de-escalated situation successfully. There was no footage. She checked the cam log. Hardware malfunction entry delayed. Another flag. Another one. Across the building, the atmosphere thickened. Conversations dropped off when certain names were mentioned. Reports that had once gone unnoticed were suddenly being reread with red pens. A tension hung in the air, subtle but sharp, like walking through fog, and realizing it smells like smoke. At his desk, Nash looked up from his screen as Laura passed him in the hallway. She didn't stop, didn't glare, just kept walking, but slower enough for him to notice, enough for it to land. His fingers hovered above his keyboard, then dropped. He rubbed his neck and looked around like someone waiting for a knock that hadn't come yet but would. Laura returned to her desk, pulled out a blank notepad, and began writing by hand. No one watched her. But if they had, they would have seen something shift behind her eyes, something no longer interested in protecting a nameplate on a door, but focused entirely on restoring the kind of trust she once thought came automatically with the badge. Sometimes change doesn't walk in shouting. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the form of a file reopened, a log printed, a look exchanged in a hallway between two people who can no longer pretend they didn't know. And that's how it starts, right there in the silence between the footsteps. They arrived just before noon, 3 black SUVs rolling silently into the rear parking lot of the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department, their windows, tinted engines barely audible beneath the buzzing cicadas and the low whine of a distant lawnmower. No sirens, no flashing lights, just presence quiet, composed, and unmistakably federal. Officers inside watched from behind blinds, some standing still as the tires crunched slowly over gravel, others pretending not to notice even as their eyes followed every movement. This wasn't a surprise visit, it was a message, one that didn't need to be spoken to be heard. Marshal Kane stepped out first, dressed in the same suit as before, though now pressed his shoes, polished his expression, unreadable beneath a pair of dark lenses. He didn't rush, he didn't scan. He just closed the door behind him, adjusted his cuff once, and nodded to the agents stepping out from the second SUV. Grace Mendoza, compact and razor-sharp, had a tablet already in hand, and a file tucked under her arm, her jaw clenched like she'd already found something to be disappointed in. Nathan Cole, tall and quiet, carried a single case with 2 sealed drives and a set of access protocols, hard-coded to override local encryption. They didn't speak as they walked to the side entrance. They didn't have to. Grace scanned her badge at the security panel, waited for the dull buzz of clearance, and pushed the door open without looking back. Inside, the air felt heavier, though the thermostat read 72. Officers stiffened as they passed, some nodding reluctantly, others pretending to read reports they weren't holding. Kane walked straight to the administrative wing, bypassing the front desk with a glance. "Is Sheriff Hodges in his office?" he asked. The deputy at the front stood quickly, nodding. "Yes, sir, he's expecting." "Good," Kane replied, already moving. He didn't knock. He opened the door and stepped inside, where Hodges sat behind a desk, cluttered with manila folders, half-read emails blinking on the screen, and a coffee cup that had gone cold an hour ago. The sheriff looked older than Kane, remembered face-drawn shirt untucked at the waist, a man who'd spent too long waiting for the inevitable to walk through his door. "I assume you received our briefing packet," Kane said evenly, placing a folder on the desk. Hodges glanced at it, then nodded without a word. Grace stepped in behind Kane, her eyes scanning the room with practiced precision, her voice clipped. "We'll need full access to the records room, personnel files, training documentation, complaint archives, and all departmental policy updates since 2019. We'll also need a list of all officers currently on duty and a log of camera maintenance reports." Hodges opened a drawer, slowly pulled out a keyring and placed it on the desk. "Everything's there. I told my staff to cooperate." Nathan had already moved toward the back of the building, following the IT technician Brian toward the server room. Brian didn't speak. He just walked, shoulders, tense eyes flicking toward every closed door like he expected one to open suddenly. Inside the server room, Nathan placed his case on the floor, opened it with a soft click, and began the process of mirroring every database connected to the body cam network, timestamp logs, access points, internal report edits, and external server pings. Within minutes, he found 2 entries marked incomplete. Both had been flagged. One had audio. He isolated the file, flagged it, and kept going. Back in the records room, Grace laid out documents across the table, like cards in a game no one wanted to play. "This policy's 4 years out of date," she said, holding up a training manual. "No escalation protocol updates, no documentation of de-escalation courses, and 0 confirmation of compliance refreshers. When was the last federal audit?" The clerk, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and perfect penmanship, shook her head slowly. "Never." In the far corner of the department, Kane sat in a small office with Sergeant Laura Bishop, who had already begun pulling files flagged from the night before. Her hands moved quickly, but her voice was quiet, almost subdued. "These reports, they all read the same," she said. "Pulled over, no cause, no ticket, vague language, camera off." Over and over, Kane nodded, eyes scanning the documents one by one. "Patterns don't lie, and culture hides in repetition." She turned her screen toward him. "Here, May of last year. Guy stopped on the way home from work. Said he was told to exit the vehicle for no reason. No arrest. No citation. Report says he was non-compliant. Kane read the entry lips tight. Same words. Same rhythm. He stood, walked to the whiteboard on the far wall, and began jotting down initials, dates, call numbers, building a web that stretched from minor infractions to major oversights. This isn't just misconduct, he said. It's structural neglect. The question is how many knew, and how many looked away. Grace entered moments later carrying a stack of outdated certifications. "We're initiating a compliance hold," she said, handing the documents to Kane. "Effective immediately, no officer from this department is to engage in field operations until the review is complete." Kane didn't hesitate. He turned and walked straight to Hodges' office, where the sheriff was staring at a phone that hadn't rung all morning. "We're shutting you down temporarily," Kane said, calm but clear. "Dispatch will remain operational. Emergency response is permitted, but field patrol is suspended until further notice." Hodges leaned forward, voice low. "You know what this will do to us." Kane met his eyes without blinking. "I know what not doing it already did." And with that, he walked out of the room past the stunned silence of uniformed men and women who had never expected accountability to wear a suit and carry a pen. Outside, the sun had started to dip low, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Kane paused at the base of the steps, glanced at the horizon, and then kept walking. The work wasn't done. It had just begun. The next morning, the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department didn't wake up so much as it braced itself. Officers arrived early but lingered in their cars a little longer, keys turning more slowly in the lock's doors, opening with hesitance instead of routine. The building felt altered. Same walls, same fluorescent hum, same coffee brewing too bitter in the corner, but something invisible had shifted overnight. The kind of shift you can't name but you feel in the way people talk quieter and look each other in the eye less. Marshal Kane walked through the front doors not like a man returning to a scene but like someone continuing an operation. No hesitation, no announcement, no flourish. He carried a thin manila folder in one hand and nothing else. No badge on display, no weapon, just the confidence of someone who knew exactly what truth looked like when you stripped away excuse. The front desk deputy greeted him with a stiff nod, eyes wide, unsure whether to salute or apologize. Kane offered a quiet morning and kept walking. He moved past the break room, past the bullpen where phones rang unanswered for a few seconds too long, past a row of lockers whose doors were now shut with a little more care than usual. When he reached the operations wing, Laura Bishop was already at her desk, sleeves rolled up, hair pulled back, a legal pad, half filled with her own notations. She looked up when he entered, not startled, but steady. She'd been expecting him. "I pulled 10 more cases from the last 18 months, she said, turning the pad toward him. Same phrasing. Same pattern. Most dismissed without contact. Kane took the pad, flipping through the pages slowly. Complaint logs. "Categorized under resolved," she said. "No follow-up documented. No internal interviews filed. Nothing but a checkbox." Kane set the pad down gently and pulled out a folded list from his coat pocket, names, dates, corresponding badge numbers. 3 of the officers involved have had 5 or more similar complaints. All closed the same way. Laura leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. "You think someone's directing the language?" Kane paused, then nodded. "Not directly. But somewhere along the way, the system trained them to phrase things a certain way so it wouldn't raise flags." Down the hallway, Grace Mendoza stood in front of the department's document archive cabinet, flipping through a binder of use-of-force protocols. Her face was unreadable, but the way her fingers tapped against the cover told a different story, one of growing impatience with every page she turned. She closed the binder with a firm snap and walked into the admin wing where Kane and Bishop were cross-referencing files. "This isn't isolated," Grace said, holding up a page. "This is a workflow, a practiced, polished way of closing the door without ever making noise." Kane nodded. "It's a system. And systems don't just build themselves." Nathan Cole entered a moment later, carrying a printout with a red tag clipped to the top. "Server logs confirmed it," he said. "Body cam footage from 6 incidents flagged for deletion. 1 attempted manual wipe after hours." Kane didn't look surprised. "Was it recovered?" Nathan handed him a USB. Partial file. One audio stream. Date matches Kane's incident. Kane plugged the drive into the nearest computer, double-clicked the file, and leaned in. The room filled with static, then a voice, his voice calm measured, asking why he was being stopped. Another voice followed, sharp, defensive, full of control. Then the sound of a car door opening, the gravel, the scuffle, the command to get on the ground, the click of handcuffs, silence. He hit stop. The room stayed quiet. "This is enough," Kane said, standing up. "This confirms the pattern. And we're not talking about one night anymore." Grace was already pulling out her phone. "We'll notify DOJ. Field suspension is active, but now we escalate to oversight." Laura spoke up, voice low but clear. "I've been here 12 years. I've trained some of these guys. I thought I was doing the right thing." Kane looked at her not with judgment but with the weight of someone who understood what it meant to wake up mid-career and realize the ground under your feet was never solid to begin with. "You probably were," he said gently, "but the right thing has to be updated, same as the policy manuals." She didn't speak again, but the way she folded her arms told him she was still listening. Outside, 2 more SUVs pulled into the lot. No rush, no uniforms, just quiet movement. The kind that came when truth was no longer a question but a mandate. Kane walked to the whiteboard, wrote 2 more initials under the column, labeled Repeat Patterns, and then circled a name, T. Nash. The marker squeaked slightly, a sound that seemed too loud in the room now filled with people who couldn't claim not to know anymore. "The audit starts today," he said, turning back. "We follow every log, every complaint, every missing second of footage. No one gets protected, no one gets left behind." And as the hum of computers and footsteps filled the building, it was clear that something fundamental had shifted, not just in the files or the policy, but in the hearts of people who could no longer claim ignorance. This wasn't about one man anymore. It was about what a department becomes when no one's watching until someone finally does. By Friday afternoon, the story had moved beyond the walls of the sheriff's department and into the heartbeat of the town. It started slow, just a headline on a local news site, "Federal agent detained in wrongful traffic stop." Then a second story followed, this time with audio from the recovered patrol car, recording grainy but undeniable. And then, without warning, it spread like wind through dry fields. By sunset, the name Marshall Kane wasn't just known, it was whispered across barbershops, grocery aisles, and dinner tables, always in the same hushed tone used when something sacred has been violated. That evening, the mayor called a town hall, short notice, wide invitation. No flyers, no politics. Just a message passed from neighbor to neighbor, church to congregation, mother to daughter. And people came. More than expected. They filled the folding chairs, lined the walls, stood in the doorways of the community center on Maple Street. Their expressions a mix of confusion, worry, and something quieter but heavier anger not yet spoken aloud. Kane didn't sit at the front. He stood near the back, arms crossed, coat still on eyes, scanning not for threat but for readiness. He wasn't there to speak. Not tonight. Tonight he was there to listen. The mayor, Harold Lanning, stepped up to the podium with the slow gait of a man who once believed he had time to prepare. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat twice, and looked out at the sea of faces staring back without expression. "We're aware of the investigation," he began. "We're cooperating with federal authorities, and we're committed to transparency and change." A few polite nods. No applause. No warmth. A woman from the back rose without being called. "Are you going to reopen the complaints?" she asked, voice strong but even. "The ones your office ignored, the ones labeled unfounded, without so much as a call back?" Lanning hesitated, fingers tapping the edge of the podium. "We're looking into that," he replied. "No," she said, her voice louder now. "Don't look. Act." The first real murmur of agreement spread through the crowd, scattered but clear. Kane's gaze didn't leave the mayor. He watched how the man blinked slower now, how he swallowed like each question was heavier than the last. One by one, more voices joined. A teenage boy with his football jersey still on spoke next. "I got stopped walking home from practice. Officer asked if the bag on my back was mine. Said I didn't answer fast enough. Told me to sit on the curb until backup came. I was 14. A woman in scrubs raised her hand. "I got pulled over twice in 1 week. Told I matched a description both times. I've been living here 10 years, never had a ticket. Then an older man stood, gray hair, hands folded behind his back, voice quiet but cutting. 1,989, he said. I was pulled over, cuffed, and told I was lucky they didn't drag me in. No report filed. No one believed me. So I stopped telling it. Until now. Each story layered on the last, not in volume but in weight. No shouting, no fists. Just truth that had been held in too long and was finally allowed to stretch. Midway through, Sheriff Hodges walked in his face, pale eyes sunken like a man still trying to outrun a storm that had already arrived. He didn't try to sit. He stepped to the front, took the mic, and cleared his throat like a man preparing to bleed publicly. I've been in this department 31 years, he began. I trained some of the officers who are now under review, and I'm here tonight not as your sheriff, but as someone who needs to say the words I should have said a long time ago. The room quieted, not to give him space, but because no one trusted what came next. We didn't know who Mr. Kane was when we detained him, Hodges continued. But that's not the problem. The problem is we didn't care who he might have been, and that's on me. A few heads nodded. Others remained still. No one interrupted. We're going to reopen those complaints, he said. All of them. And we'll cooperate with federal oversight. Anyone involved in a pattern of abuse will be investigated, including me. A woman near the front stood. Talk is cheap, she said. Hodges nodded once. Then hold me to it. Kane didn't move, but Laura Bishop, standing 2 rows over, glanced at him with a look that asked a quiet question. Do you believe him? He didn't answer out loud. Just watched the room, the people, the shift in posture, the way the silence felt different now. Less fearful, more alert. After the mayor returned to the mic to mumble thanks and encourage civic patience, the crowd didn't disperse quickly. They lingered in clusters near the exits, talking low, some exchanging numbers, some revisiting memories, some finally saying things they hadn't allowed themselves to before. Kane stepped outside into the night air, cool now, tinged with the distant smell of fresh-cut grass and rain that hadn't arrived yet. Tamara Wells joined him, hands in her jacket pockets, her voice quiet. Didn't think this many people would show. They always do, Kane replied, when they stop being afraid of their own silence. They stood in silence a moment longer, listening to the rustle of movement inside, the voices rising and falling, like a town slowly remembering its own strength. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But something had shifted. Not in the system, but in the people watching it. And sometimes that's where real change begins, not in headlines or courtroom rulings, but in the way a room leans forward when someone finally tells the truth out loud. Monday morning came with a kind of hush that didn't feel like peace. It felt like the quiet that comes before something breaks. The sun was out, but low and uncertain, and the sidewalks near City Hall were unusually empty, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Inside the building, beneath the old fluorescent lights and faded state seal, 3 people waited in a meeting room that had seen more birthday cakes and retirement speeches than moments like this. Marshall Kane sat at one end of the conference table, his folder, already open pen, resting across the top of the first page. To his left, Grace Mendoza clicked a ballpoint slowly, rhythmically, her eyes scanning her own set of documents with the kind of stillness that comes from long practice. Tamara Wells sat beside her, wearing a dark blazer she rarely wore, unless the stakes were high. Her notepad was blank, but her mind wasn't. She'd seen the shift last week from apathy to discomfort, and discomfort to pressure. And now it was time to see if pressure would finally lead to action. Mayor Harold Lanning entered the room with a weak smile, the kind meant for cameras even when no one was filming. He nodded to each of them, but didn't make small talk. He didn't ask how the weekend went. He knew better. The air wasn't thick with hostility, it was thick with consequence. And he could feel it gathering around him like a storm he couldn't defer anymore. Kane didn't bother with pleasantries. He opened the folder and pushed it across the table. These are the preliminary findings, he said, his voice level no sharpness but no softness either. 5. Confirmed violations of departmental policy. 3 instances of report falsification. 2 cases of tampered body cam footage. And 1 active attempt to obstruct a federal inquiry. The mayor's face didn't change, but his hands tensed around his coffee cup like it might crack under the pressure. Are you recommending prosecution? Kane didn't answer right away. He looked at Grace, who gave a small nod, then back to the mayor. "We're recommending a full personnel audit, immediate, and the removal of Officer Troy Nash." Lanning set the coffee down slowly. "That's one of our most senior patrol officers." Tamara leaned forward, her voice steady. "He's also responsible for at least 4 closed complaints where footage went missing, all involving the same racial bias pattern. The community knows. They're watching. And they're not interested in half measures." The room was quiet except for the low hum of the building's ancient air conditioning unit. Lanning looked down at the folder again, like the paper might offer him a different truth if he stared hard enough. "You're asking me to fire someone who's been with this department for over 15 years. "We're not asking," Kane replied. "We're giving you the opportunity to lead before you're forced to follow." It wasn't a threat, it was a reality. For a long moment the mayor said nothing. Then, without lifting his head, he spoke quietly. "I'll issue the termination letter today." Kane closed the folder. "We'll be monitoring compliance. Any delay or deviation from this process will result in escalation." Lanning didn't respond. He just sat there staring at the table, shoulders a little lower than when he walked in. When the meeting ended, Kane didn't linger. He walked outside into the crisp morning light, blinking once, then letting his eyes adjust. He didn't check his phone. He didn't speak. He simply took in the square, the benches, the flags, the quiet movement of people, pretending it was an ordinary Monday. Back at the department, Officer Troy Nash was called into Sheriff Hodges's office. The request had come through official channels, but the outcome was already known. Nash walked in stiffly, eyes darting between the floor and the old framed commendations on the wall. Hodges handed him a single envelope. "What's this?" "Termination," Hodges said, his voice flat. "Effective immediately. Signed by the mayor. Federal compliance order attached." Nash stared at the envelope, then at the sheriff. "That's it." "That's it," Hodges said. "You think it shouldn't be?" Nash hesitated. "I did what I thought was right. I didn't know." "You didn't care," Hodges interrupted. "That's the part that did you in." Nash left through the side door. No uniform, no goodbyes, just the sound of the latch clicking shut behind him. Tamara stood in the hallway outside the office, arms folded, watching the department shift like a house that had finally admitted it had termites. Some faces looked relieved, others looked bitter. But the change had happened, and there was no closing that door now. Later that evening, Kane returned to the community center, not for a speech, but for a meeting with the same people who had spoken up days earlier. They asked questions, they pushed, and they expected answers. This time they got them. As the sky darkened outside, Kane sat with the mayor, the sheriff, Grace, and 2 DOJ representatives to begin drafting the new departmental protocols: mandatory training audits, camera usage, accountability, anonymous complaint mechanisms, quarterly public reporting. No one clapped. No cameras flashed. No victory was declared. But the work had finally started. Quiet, slow, necessary. And that for now was enough. The sun had already dipped below the rooftops by the time Marshal Kane stepped outside the department building for the last time. The light was soft and stretched long across the street, casting shadows that didn't threaten but lingered, like thoughts too quiet to speak. The air carried that familiar scent of warm pavement cooling under nightfall, and somewhere down the block, wind chimes knocked gently against a porch rail. It was the kind of evening that made small towns feel honest again, even when they weren't yet. Kane stood still for a moment on the concrete steps, his hand resting on the railing, watching the last of the clerks switch off their lights behind the frosted glass. Inside, a team from the DOJ was still cross-checking records, confirming badge numbers, logging complaints, reviewing training videos that hadn't been watched in years. They didn't rush. This part always took time, but it was happening. Slowly, carefully, thoroughly. In his jacket pocket, his phone vibrated twice, then stopped. He didn't check it. Not yet. Instead, he looked out across the street, where a group of high schoolers in hoodies and sneakers leaned against the side of a diner, laughing, 2 loud heads, tilted back in that careless way teenagers lean into freedom. One of them caught his eye, a boy in a navy sweatshirt with wide shoulders and curious eyes. The kid gave him a nod, not the kind that said hello, but the kind that said, "I saw what you did." Kane returned the gesture with a quiet lift of his chin. There was no ceremony, no speeches, no press. He didn't need it. Inside the department, Tamara Wells watched from the end of the hallway as Officer Curtis Dell cleaned out his desk. He moved slowly, stuffing files into a box without looking up, his face, drawn eyes red not from tears but from knowing. Knowing he'd pushed it too far for too long. Knowing it didn't matter anymore whether it started with malice or just momentum. It ended the same. He placed his nameplate on top of the stack and closed the box gently like it contained something fragile. Maybe it did. As he walked out, he passed Tamara without a word. She didn't stop him. She didn't speak. She just watched, her arms folded, heart quiet, mind racing through all the years she thought silence was safer. But now she knew better. Kane crossed the square slowly, his footsteps soft on the cracked brick path that led toward the parking lot. He wasn't in a hurry. He never was. His rental car sat just where he left it, the windshield catching the fading amber light like a memory you weren't ready to let go of. He slid into the driver's seat, shut the door, and took a long breath before turning the key. The engine hummed to life without protest, smooth and steady like the work he carried inside him. On the passenger seat lay a fresh file, one he'd started that morning, filled with names from a different town in a different state. A place with a different badge, but the same problem. The work didn't end. It just moved. He picked up the phone and tapped a number from memory. One ring. Then a voice answered on the other end. "You ready?" "Yeah," Kane said. "Send me the next location." There was a pause. "Already?" "Already," he replied, eyes on the road ahead. Then he hung up. He didn't drive off right away. He let the moment sit. Let it breathe. Because that's what people never saw in the reports, in the hearings, in the internal memos. They never saw what it cost to keep walking into places like this and dismantle what had been built on decades of denial. They saw the badge. They heard the voice. But they didn't feel the weight of being the one who had to stay calm when others got loud, who had to stay kind when others got cruel, who had to be precise when others got reckless. This wasn't justice wrapped in banners. It was accountability written in margins, confirmed in silence, anchored by facts that couldn't be rewritten once they were spoken aloud. As Kane pulled away from the curb, he passed the diner again. The boy in the navy sweatshirt was still there, still watching. This time he raised a hand. Kane didn't wave. He just smiled, soft and tired but real. Because in the end it wasn't about proving who he was. It was about proving who they could be. If someone reminded them that the system wasn't broken by accident, it was built that way, and anything built can be rebuilt. But only if someone is willing to stay long enough to dig out the rot, speak the truth, and leave no one behind just because it would have been easier to look away. He didn't need a parade. He just needed the next address, and a road that would take him there. Sometimes the loudest message comes from the quietest man in the room. Marshal Kane didn't yell, didn't threaten. He just stood firm in the face of injustice and let the truth do the heavy lifting. And through his silence, his calm, his resolve, we're reminded of something vital, that dignity is not given, it's upheld. That respect shouldn't depend on uniforms, titles, or how loud your voice carries, but on how you choose to treat people when no one's watching. This story isn't just about one man standing up. It's about what happens when communities start listening, when silence is broken, and when truth refuses to stay buried. It's about how systems change, not overnight, not with noise, but with consistent pressure, clear eyes, and people brave enough to do what's right, even when it's hard. So if this story moved you even just a little, don't let it end here. Share it. Let it live on in conversations, in your thoughts, in your values. Talk about it with your children, your neighbors, your community, because justice, real justice, starts with awareness, and awareness begins with stories that can't be ignored. And if you haven't already, go ahead, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that little bell so you don't miss the next story. Because we're not done, not by a long shot, and together we'll keep the light on truths that some folks would rather keep in the dark. Thanks for watching. Stay strong, stay aware, and stay human.